Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Billboard. I'm Charlie Riley, head of marketing at OneScreen. I'm joined once again by my co-host and the co-founder of OneScreen, Greg Wise. We're here with a special guest that I wish I hit record on this episode about 5 minutes ago, because Aaron Keller was just spitting some knowledge about brand and advertising and out of home, and just a lot of great nuggets that I know we'll get into in a few seconds. I want to introduce Aaron Keller, co-founder of Capsule. If you maybe, Aaron, just want to give a quick overview of who Capsule is and what you do, and then we'll get into the brand conversation because you bring a lot of great thoughts to it.
And I had to cut you off. Save it for the pod, Aaron. Save it for the pod.
We are a special projects agency. We were formed a year Prince made famous 25 years ago, and we live in the Greenbelt Brewery building here in Minneapolis, and do work for brands like Patagonia, Arc'teryx, Hydro Flask, Quick Trip, and a variety of others locally and nationally. So that's a bit on us. And the book that I was going to reference there, which is the Physics of Brand book, in which we got to the value of brands through physics, not only practically, but metaphorically as well.
You referenced some great brands that you work with. Your philosophy of brand, obviously you've been around crafting brands for many years. Tell us about your philosophy of that.
Yeah, so brands are an extension of us as human beings, right? We invented these things out in the world that represent us as individuals and as groups of people, right? You have a big company that, has a bunch of people, and those brands that they have in the marketplace represent them. And so there's part of it is we need to humanize brands to the degree that they represent the best of us, not the worst of us, because we get to design them in such a way through the experiences that people have with them and all kinds of other stuff. And they have value. Every single day, a business is either contributing to the value of the brand or contributing to sales, or both at the same time. And hopefully, if they're on an upward trajectory, those two things are happening at the same time, which is nice, right? And so our view on brands is they are living members of our community, and that we need to respect and value them that way and give them the love and attention they deserve. Some have fallen behind. Some are just skyrocketing, as we talked about Liquid Death and what they've been doing, and the interesting examples coming out of that, interesting learnings from them, what they're creating. So yeah, that's a little bit on our view on brands. You have to buy the book, The Physics of Brand, to go really deep on our philosophy on brands. I know mixing philosophy and physics is kind of scary as hell, but yeah, one of those things.
I never thought physics and brand would be used in the same sentence, but I dig it, Aaron. I like it. Everything you mentioned makes a lot of sense. Give me your sense. So Charlie and I talk about this all the time, are thinking about it, but just the word brand. And I know your professional career is focused around brand, but it hasn't really been at the forefront like it is now, or I should say it's back in the forefront. At least that's what we're seeing. What are you guys seeing in regards to the importance around brand?
So our definition, which you'd get out of the book as well, is a brand is a container of trust and meaning. Okay, so it's not a logo, it's not a campaign. It is a container of something, right? A container of trust and meaning. And trust has been declining, not at a precipitous pace, but it's pretty hideous how far trust has been declining in institutions, in government, in businesses, in a lot of places. So to have these things that are out there that you can trust in, that you can rely on, that are consistently going to be there for you and then deliver for you as far as what they promise, is a critical thing in our society, right? As trust is central to our social contracts, right? If we don't have trust, you don't trust that I'm going to show up. You don't trust that I'm going to say something smart and not obnoxious and not swear, whatever else. It's just trust is the central thing. And then meaning is the other piece that's really important in that, right? We are seeking meaning in our lives as religions decline broadly, or the participation of religions decline. People are seeking meaning in their lives, and they're turning to brands. And you can see that showing up in a lot of different ways. In some cases, I don't know that I think that's a good thing. I think there's more stability in a lot of religions out there in the world and better, stronger roots. But if brands can fit in there for some people, that's great. So that's my view on it.
Specifically speaking with you guys, just your experience, brand, because brand can incorporate a lot of different things. So how does a brand show up to build that trust? Literally, what are the tactics? And maybe use some examples, right? Because I know you guys work with Patagonia, you work with some of the largest brands, and you've worked with some of the largest international Fortune 50 businesses. So tell us, literally, what does brand mean to us? A component of it, out of home, right?
Yeah.
What else?
Yeah, I love out of home. I love things that, like I said earlier, break through the boringness of a drive or the boringness of a walk to work or a boringness in life, right? step into your life in a different way. I find that to be, because we do live in a very much an attention economy. People
Yes.
and digital and social have taken a lot of our attention. So it's nice that other mediums can get some of that attention back. And as far as brands contributing to trust, the consistency of being there and delivering on the promises, there's a lot of examples of when it comes to Patagonia. And then people have this image in their minds about what Patagonia is as far as their mission. We are in business to save the planet. We're not in business for all the other social causes. We're in business to save the planet. You don't see them involved in a lot of other stuff. And there's also a realm where we talk about brands should not be involved in politics. Politics is dangerous for brands, very dangerous territory for them to head into, because there's a lot of fighting, and usually the politicians win because they love to fight. That's what they're good at. Brands, not so good at fighting sometimes and get hurt. But Patagonia has done an elegant job of standing for something and sticking to that. And they have built a really valuable brand over time. But they make products for the military. They have Broken Arrow that makes products for the military. So some perceptions you have out there, oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't expect that. But, the military needs high quality, and they build high quality products that last. And the reason they do that is because if it lasts a long time, you don't buy another one. You don't waste. Fast fashion is the antithesis of Patagonia, which you'd expect, because it ends up in a landfill after one wear. And there's other things that are the antithesis of Patagonia, things like perceived obsolescence, like Apple does with their products in some cases, right? They try to have you wear something as long as possible. So things that have longevity, which fits their mission in the world, they live up to that. There's situations where they, just like everybody else, run into conflicts, right? If they run into things that are in conflict with their mission, with conflict with what's going on in society that they have to deal with. But they are just solidly in their world. Like there's a story of when we were on a research project with them, I was in Germany, and they got dinged because, of course, they're the most visible, and there were sheep that were being abused in the wool industry. And merino wool is a very important ingredient in the outdoor industry as far as insulation. And they have a lot of product, and it's growing and doing very well. But at this time, and this is now probably 8 or 10 years ago, they got dinged and they had to stop using any merino wool until they figured out their supply chain. And I got that information from a store manager in Munich, right? And it goes through the organization with no conflict whatsoever. People are just like, yeah, we're getting out of merino wool, which means like to them, it's like cutting off your right arm for a period of time until you figure it out, because it's going to impact sales. It's going to impact everybody. But they all know it's the thing they need to do. It's the right thing to do. So there's just no friction. And a really good culture like that, stuff spreads really quickly and really efficiently, which is a good indication of culture and a good indication of the people inside that organization getting why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing. Totally makes sense. And building that trust of Patagonia is not going to be in that anymore, right? Until we figured out our supply chain, which took them a year, but they did it, and they did it well.
It's so interesting because the first thing you mentioned was like, you said it much more eloquently than this, but focus, stay in your lane with that one mission. I think that's an incredible perspective, because when brands try to be everything to everyone is where that message can get lost in translation. On the Patagonia note, you guys did, I would love for you to walk us through this, but the reimagining the sushi roll structure for some of their packaging that they did. I'm curious if you can walk us through nuts and bolts of how that came to be. You also, it looks like you used obviously like in-person research, but also mobile data to also just like come up with the analysis. Can you walk us through that? Because it's fascinating.
Yeah. If you think about the intersection between a billboard or an out-of-home environment and how that intersection happens and the resources that are spent to get people to that moment in retail, right? There's just billions and billions of dollars spent to get people to that moment. And if you haven't studied that moment of intersection and understood like there's all kinds of little nuances happening in that moment, then you're really missing out on the opportunity to design that moment for yourself, right? To selfishly have that benefit your brand the most. When they first came to us, they said, we need a new packaging design, but we don't need any research because we're Patagonia. We know our brand, we know our stuff. I'm like, okay, but we think you should do this research. Have you studied that moment of intersection? And they said, no, we haven't. And you're right. We probably should. So we studied that globally in person, but then also use a mobile research tool that essentially sends consumers out to shop. And then we interview them and they collect a bunch of data on their phone, and because you can take photographs in retail more now. And then they fed that back to us from Germany. We did it in Japan and then a bunch of cities in the US. And that fed us all the knowledge to say, okay, what's happening at that moment? How can we design that moment to the advantage of Patagonia? And then where could that show up in other places? So that fed into the design of the package, to the display, to all the structure of the package, all the other stuff down the road that made that just so much better. So when it hit really well and circulated really quick, because it's a big product in their portfolio, and they sell a lot of base layer, and messing it up means it skews or goes down. And packaging can have the biggest impact. You always see these packaging stories like Tropicana, Sun Chips, all these packaging stories of, because if you do it wrong, sales go off a table, right? They just drop in the worst way. If you do it right, you can see an increase. If you do it mediocre, which is sad, they just stay the same, which is a lot of that out there where people just don't do something compelling when it comes to their packaging and then test it to make sure it can work. So research is a critical part of that because you're messing with that moment and there's already a pattern in place. Just like your drive home, there's that pattern. You walk through grocery or walk through any other retail situation. If you're messing with a pattern that exists in consumer culture, you can lose from that. And it happens more often than it needs to, honestly, just with a little bit more research. Yeah, that's why the research method, then the design, and then the testing at the end of that to make sure it's done right.
Aaron, I want to jump back to two words you used a couple times, trust and conflict, because a lot of marketing leaders that may be listening are probably having those two feelings internally of getting trust from their board, their CEO, their CFO, potentially conflict on marketing budget when it comes to investing in brand, investing in out of home as a channel they may not have used. I'm curious of your thoughts on that in a sense of like how you help your clients champion for maybe new experiments, new channels, brand marketing. Because I know that, like Greg said, brand's coming back, but there's a conflict between demand gen and brand marketing, that the measurement and the attribution. I guess I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, you can see trust as a social lubricant, right? It makes things much more efficient. It makes things move faster and easier. And when it comes to out of home, that's typically more top of funnel stuff, right? And then all the stuff that's bottom of funnel, which is more measurable and more attractive to a lot of people because I can get sales now. We need sales now. But what it doesn't do is it isn't a good social lubricant. It doesn't do the stuff that the top of funnel stuff does, that builds brand, that builds trust, that builds awareness, that builds knowledge, and all the pieces that feed the bottom of funnel. And if you don't do both, at some point in time, the brand will die for various reasons. There's just too many examples of bottom funnel brands. That's all they live down there, and they struggle to find any lubricant. And what you get is constant cultural friction. I can't possibly trust you because you're just not in my life. You're just always bombarding me with shit that I don't want to see. Versus, hey, I'm going to invite you in to the brand, to the conversation, through creativity, through sharing knowledge, through being a part of your community, to all the other stuff. Again, it's like having a person in your life that's coming and knocking on your door every day. That's what that bottom of funnel stuff is, right? Hey, can you buy me? Can you buy me every fucking day? Who wants that? You're like, no, we're going to call the police. We're going to have a restraining order on you. Damn it. That should be allowed with brands. There should be a restraining order for brands. You can't get near me anymore because you're just pissing me off. And there's a lot of brands that do that. And we saw that with all attribution and following people around. Oh, that's great. And now I just search for that thing. Because of course you're in a business, then we're in a business where we're searching for products of all sorts all the time. And then look at that. They just follow me around everywhere else I go, which is a little stalkerish. And some of it, I get it. Makes sense. And as a marketer, some of it like tickles the brain a bit. You're like, we can do that. Oh, should we do that? Let's have a pause there for a second, maybe just a little bit, and more of that other stuff too. Right? Because we can't forget the top of the funnel or the building the social lubricant that helps the bottom of the funnel happen more efficiently.
It's a challenge as a marketer, I think, where is that balance of knocking on someone's door every day versus reminding them how you can help, and it's without being over the top. Too much of that knocking on the door, and how do you complement that without being too much? I think it's a difficult balance.
Yeah. Culturally, you can almost see it as the metric would be people showing up in cabins and liking cabin photos and places where there are no media, right? You just separate yourself from all of this. You can't be bombarded with anything because people are just getting so sick of that kind of stuff. But a product experience, or having this broader experience and thinking about all those potential moments that you would intersect with a brand in a more thoughtful manner, totally makes sense for now. You got street teams. Yeah, why wouldn't we? I mean, I'm amazed how many times Red Bull showed up at our office with cases of Red Bull. And they must have figured out the influential nature of being in the business we're in, that we're going to keep making sure those guys are fully supplied. And honestly, I don't really drink Red Bull. I find it fascinating as a brand. I love the brand and what they've done historically. They're just total freaking rock stars. I'm not the consumer. One, because I get overly twitchy if I drink it, and the people around me would keep it away from me if I drank it too much really quickly. It's a dangerous thing, because I do believe caffeine is a performance enhancement drug in this business for sure.
You name some of the major brands, but Red Bull sells an experience, or
Right.
they don't sell sugar water. They sell the idea that you can fly, or that you can do some of these crazy things and skate down some, it sells an experience that it's like the reality for a few seconds of, wow, humans can do that. And in theory, they're selling a drink. But
Aaron, question for you. Kind of on that note, but you go back to, we talked about the Patagonia example. And what is the why behind a company comes to you guys and says, we need to rebrand or focus on brand in general? Because you work with big companies like a Patagonia, who at this point, I think brand is probably a staple in terms of like the nomenclature they use internally. There's probably an understanding that brand might not be able to be measured like demand gen or performance marketing. But you have smaller brands that come to you, right? Dinner Bell, other folks. When did they come to you? What size companies and why?
Yeah, that's a funny one, or a fascinating one. Dinner Bell, one of the largest milk cooperatives, they launched that product themselves. Typically, they're supplying other companies that need dairy products. They're called AMPI, is the holding company. So they're a bunch of farmers, farmer owned essentially. So you've got a coalition of your investors are farmers, right? And they're not really necessarily immediately into building brands or suspicious of brands, but they've got a brand. They're building the AMPI. And then a new team member came in. He's like, we can really actually build a consumer brand with Dinner Bell. And we started mapping it out and say, yeah, this is possible. And this has actually been showing up in a lot of other places where people that are suppliers or ingredient suppliers and other things have realized, why don't we go for that thing that's the big intangible, right? Because so what makes up the stock market are intangible assets. It's not physical assets. So if you're a supplier of ingredients, you've got a bunch of physical assets. They have a depreciation rate schedule that's already figured out. Intangible assets are very sexy, right? They're totally different. They're harder to manage because you're like, what is a brand? I don't know. How do I contribute to the value? How do I know when it's valuable? And there are measurement techniques, but they're still fairly ambiguous and challenging to get to, but to actually get to a number. But those situations, like building a brand when you're a company that actually is more of an ingredient provider, that's what that was. Those are situations like people launching new ventures altogether, and they're like, I want to do this thing that's called building a brand. I want to have a brand, right? And it is kind of like, oh, I need a logo, right? Literally, they're like, well, I need a logo. Okay, well, do you have a trademarked name? No, I don't know. I registered it with the state of Minnesota. No, the trademark office is at the federal level. You need a trademark for that name in order to own it, because part of brand is the intellectual property behind it. And so making sure they've got all the things properly set up. We're designing for success for them by making sure they don't have all those ugly potholes that people run into when they do something a little bit haphazardly, right? They're like, I'm just going to throw something out there. All of a sudden you're successful, but you're not, because you don't have a trademark, or you haven't thought something else through, or you're creating your own friction essentially when you're building the brand. So a lot of new product stuff, which has been a big thing for us in the past really 4 years, messaging around that, the products themselves. And then we have implementers who do the media buying and the other partner kind of work. So we're supplying assets to other people, other partners downstream, essentially, to create. But we're coming up with the original idea, getting it sold through, getting it off the ground for the client, and then launched.
Love that. It makes sense. And just to give some context why I asked too, because when we hear brand, and what you said makes a lot of sense. You have your early stage, I'm in my parents' basement, I'm launching a website. Like, what is my brand? Then you have giant companies. The folks in between, I feel like there's a bit of purgatory, right? Where it's, okay, I'm a digitally native brand. I've built my business using digital ads, but now I got to focus on that sort of like long-term sustainable growth. But then there's a balance between, if we put $1 into it, what do we expect to get out? It's like, brand doesn't necessarily work that way. We see a shift in that mindset. We're getting there. So I think what you said makes a ton of sense. in the sense of what brand means, the different tactics, branding, how it shows up aisles of a store, right? The soap product that you guys did, redesigned it, and being on a shelf and how these stand out. You're essentially creating these mini billboards everywhere,
Yeah.
right? You
Yeah.
are a billboard, you are in front, you represent the company, you have to evoke a feeling. I love that. And I think that when you really think about it as a consumer, you start to realize why a brand is so effective.
Yeah, you're right. In your business, when we're doing the packaging work, we're building billboards that you can pick up.
That's right.
Right. It's about the same amount of time you have too to intersect to get people's attention. And then they hopefully go deeper. Yours is the outdoor generally it's harder to make that immediate connection. Though it was a period of time when QR codes started showing up in billboards and people are scanning them. And I could see it like at a bus stop, but shit, on a billboard on the freeway, that's dangerous as hell.
Wait,
Right.
but
Like,
walk us through, but getting in this conversation when we weren't recording, Charlie, you walked us through the example. You were out of home example though, because is because yes, what you just talked about is if you're in an aisle, it's contextually relevant. But in fact, that's one of the reasons why we started One Screen is because we realized that the industry itself needed to be marketed and modernized in a way where people understood the fact that you can leverage audience plus context. And you walked through an example in the beginning of our conversation. Tell us about that again, because context was used.
Yeah. I'll give you that one. First, I want to add to what you said, which I think is very important, is you are advancing the industry, which is part of, as an industry, we need to also innovate in the creative field. We have to continue to innovate. And honestly, the pressure is greater on us and the fact that consumers are learning. So when you hear an average consumer say, I'm not the demo for that, that's marketing language entering current general culture. What the hell are they saying? Demo. They shortened it down to demo. That means you should clearly be advancing how you're marketing. If they're getting smarter, we got to get smarter. That's just a natural need out there. But yeah, the billboard example I was talking about was this Myth Nightclub that we helped launch and create the brand around and the excitement around. And in order to launch it, we did this teaser campaign, predominantly in billboards. And it was done because they were launching this club in a suburb of Minneapolis called Maplewood. And right outside the club, once you walk out after a night of debauchery, you'd see a Toys R Us. So it's not the place you go to see Metallica, right? You wouldn't think, but they were going to have some really marquee band members, and they did it. And like the space is designed in an amazing way. Some of our design stuff influenced the interior design and the visual language we were doing. So that back and forth was cool. But overall, this is an incredibly cool experience once you got in there. But you walk out and you're like, I'm freaking in a suburb in Minneapolis, in Maplewood, Minnesota. And so they had to build the cachet. They had to build something around this. It's got a cool factor. And the billboards are really helpful in doing that as a teaser. You're like, what is myth? I mean, not even like the billboards with the visual language of the billboards, the supermodels you had on there and the identity. It wasn't much. It was really a model dancing or what looked like she was dancing and then the logo. And that was it. Myth Nightclub. You're like, what is that? I've never heard of Myth Nightclub. And it kind of, if you think about it, like, it's got to be local. It's got to be here. Like, who the hell's going to advertise a club that's in Vegas? But though a lot of our inspiration came from Vegas, the team did research in Vegas to figure out like what things were coming out of Vegas would be interesting for the club. And so that was definitely a good thing to capture attention, have people see this thing that was coming, that you could support it with all the other stuff around it, the website, the social, all the other pieces. So
shout out to Maplewood, Minnesota. Billboards around Maplewood, was there a radius that you guys looked at that would drive to the club?
It was basically it wasn't anything really close to the club itself. It was more out in the burbs, the other burbs of the city, essentially, that we dropped the billboards, and they seemed to fit in those other contexts. And we didn't need a lot of them, honestly. It was a combination of the creative and how dramatic it was, and I knew it was.
That's smart placement. You're drawing from that's strategic to figure out where you're drawing in from other people. But then I'm sure word of mouth and people sharing pictures of that, like that extends that exposure. So that's smart placement.
The people of Maplewood would see it, right? It also had its own billboard in the fact that if you were driving on one of the major freeways, you couldn't help but see this Myth Nightclub and go, what the hell is that doing there? So that was just natural in that area already. So we really had to hit the southern and western suburbs, which would be opposite essentially in the city. And we got this freeway that goes all the way around the entire city. It's 694 and 494. And so it was in those areas. So again, shout out to our freeway system.
Audience, context, precise targeting. And I think one of the misconceptions with out of home is you have to spend a ton in order to make an impact. And in some markets, that is actually true.
Yep.
But a market like in and around Maplewood, you don't. But a strategically placed billboard or a handful can actually make a giant impact when placed. And then you also mentioned when the creative is done, but then also the next step. And what I'm picking up from what you're throwing down is it's almost like the juxtaposition between the audience and the creative was just like there was such, what is that? It doesn't, like, it almost didn't make sense that it stuck, right? Like nightclub, you have supermodels on there, you have Metallica on there in the middle of the upper class Minnesota suburb.
It looked like it was Vegas. It had a little bit of Vegas going on. It stuck out in that kind of way. And there are those, not, that like, well, that doesn't fit here, but I like it. I want to be there, especially on the teenage kid side of things, maybe a little older. But.
That's an awesome campaign example. And I think that's probably a good place to maybe throw it back to you, Aaron, to say, if someone wants to learn how to stand out in a suburb or in other places in retail or elsewhere, or to find your book, how can people get a hold of you?
Capsule.us is our website. capsule.us. That's pretty easy. And then the book is on Amazon, the Physics of Brand book. Of course, if you want to buy that, you want to come visit and I'll sign it for you if anybody's in town ever. And we love stories like this. As I mentioned before we got on this, we had a wonderful pitch to Liquid Death we just had that was phenomenal, a wonderful conversation and a lot of learnings from that brand and what they're doing culturally and otherwise. They're forming new places that I think more brands need to learn from and see what they're accomplishing. It's really fascinating. Great to meet you guys. Thank you for the time and the conversation and the thoughtful listening. It's very cool.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Shout out to Liquid Death also. And also quick shout out to Maplewood, home of the Panthers. So go Panthers. A little research here towards the end. Yeah.
Go Panthers. Go Panthers.
Since we're in marketing, we'll target the ads towards that audience.
Aaron, thanks so much.
That's great.
Folks, appreciate you tuning into another episode of Beyond the Billboard. I'm Greg Wise. For Charlie Riley, we will see you on the next episode. Thanks, Aaron.
All right. Thank you, guys.